The 85C Bakery Cafe was a prestigious establishment, known for its delectable pastries and aromatic coffee. But behind its polished facade, an eerie sense of impending doom lurked, one that I, as an employee, could not escape. My name is Sarah, and I had worked at the cafe for a little over a year. I was initially drawn to the place by its impeccable reputation and the allure of sweet treats that could transport anyone to heaven with a single bite. However, as the days turned into weeks and then months, I began to notice the subtle, disquieting oddities that surrounded the bakery. It all began one gloomy evening. I was closing up shop, wiping down the counters and cleaning the glass display cases when I heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible, like a faint breeze rustling through leaves. I strained my ears, but it vanished as swiftly as it had come. I dismissed it as a trick of my overactive imagination, chalking it up to exhaustion from a long day of work. Days turned into weeks, and the whispers persisted. They were elusive enough to make me question my sanity. When I mentioned them to my coworkers, they exchanged worried glances, but never admitted to hearing anything. I knew they thought I was going mad. Then there was the music. The cafe had a collection of vintage records that played softly in the background, adding to the ambiance. But sometimes, late at night, when I was alone in the dimly lit cafe, the music would change. The lilting melodies turned into dissonant, discordant tunes that grated on my nerves. It felt as if something unseen was tampering with the turntable, but every time I rushed to check, everything appeared normal. I tried to ignore these unsettling occurrences, but they only escalated. Objects would move when no one was around. Pastry displays would be rearranged overnight, and I would find half-empty cups of coffee on tables that had been empty just moments before. I couldn't explain any of it, and it gnawed at my sanity. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, ominous shadows throughout the cafe, I was closing up shop once again. I could feel the dread building inside me, like a weight pressing down on my chest. Just as I was about to lock the front door, I heard a voice. "Help me," it whispered, faint but undeniable. I spun around, scanning the empty cafe. There was no one there. Trembling, I muttered, "Who's there?" The only response was a shiver that ran down my spine. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding in my chest. Something was terribly wrong, and I couldn't deny it any longer. That night, I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, I returned to the cafe after hours, determined to uncover the source of the eerie occurrences. As I moved through the darkened space, the cafe took on an even more sinister atmosphere. The vintage records crackled ominously, and the whispering seemed to intensify. I reached the kitchen, where the ovens and mixers stood silent in the gloom. That's what I saw, a shadowy figure in the corner. My heart leaped into my throat as I pointed my flashlight towards it. The figure was a man, dressed in tattered clothing, his back turned to me. He seemed to be muttering to himself. "Help me," he whispered again, his voice trembling with desperation. I took a step closer, my fear warring with my concern. "Are you okay?" I asked cautiously. The man turned to face me, and my blood ran cold. His face was contorted in anguish, his eyes hollow and empty. His skin was ashen, and his fingers were skeletal, like a corpse risen from the grave. "Help me," he moaned once more, his voice a mournful lament. I stumbled back, my heart racing. It was then that I noticed the name tag on his chest, Joseph. But I knew Joseph. He had been a regular customer, a cheerful man who had visited the cafe every morning for years. He couldn't possibly be the wretched apparition before me. I fled the cafe, leaving the terrifying specter behind. I couldn't make sense of what I had seen, and I was overcome with a sense of dread that clung to me like a second skin. The next day, I returned to work, trying to convince myself that it had all been a hallucination, a trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion. But the cafe had changed. The whispers were louder, more insistent, and the music had turned into a cacophony of dissonance that grated on my nerves. As I went about my duties, I noticed the customers behaving strangely. They sat at the tables, their eyes vacant, lost in their own thoughts. Some seemed to be muttering to themselves, their voices filled with despair. Others stared blankly into their half-empty coffee cups, as if searching for answers in the dark brew. I approached a customer I recognized, a regular named Mrs. Johnson, who had always been friendly and chatty. She sat alone at a corner table, her gaze fixed on something I couldn't see. "Mrs. Johnson, is everything all right?" I asked, my voice quivering. She turned to me, her eyes empty and filled with tears. "I can't leave," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've been here for days, but I can't leave." I felt a chill run down my spine. I had to get out of there, away from the cafe and its haunting presence. But as I made my way to the front door, I realized it was locked. Panic set in as I rattled the handle, but it refused to budge. I turned to look at the customers, all of them trapped in their own private hells, lost in a sea of despair. And that's when I saw him again, the wretched figure of Joseph, his skeletal fingers outstretched toward me. "Help me," he moaned, his voice a pitiful plea. I backed away, my heart pounding. There was no escape. The cafe had become a prison, a place of torment and anguish. I was trapped, just like the others. Days turned into weeks, and time lost all meaning. The cafe became a nightmarish purgatory, and the whispers and dissonant music were a constant torment. I watched as the customers withered away, their spirits broken by the unrelenting despair that hung in the air. I tried to communicate with them, to console them, but it was as if they were in another world, unreachable and lost. And Joseph, the tortured soul, who had once been a regular customer, haunted my every step, his anguished cries echoing in my mind. One night, as I sat in the darkness surrounded by the broken souls of the cafe, I heard a voice within me. It was Joseph's voice, but it was different, stronger. "Find the key," he urged, his words resonating in my mind. The key. It was the only way out. I searched the cafe frantically, tearing through drawers and cabinets, desperate to escape the torment that had consumed me. And then, in a dusty corner of the kitchen, I found the key to the front door. With trembling hands, I unlocked the door and pushed it open. The night air rushed in, cold and refreshing. I stepped outside, leaving behind the haunted cafe and its tormented souls. As I walked away from that accursed place, I knew that I would never be the same. The horrors I had witnessed would stay with me forever, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath even the most prestigious facade. The 85C Bakery Cafe had been a place of sweet indulgence and bitter despair, and I had narrowly escaped its clutches.